Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we are going to take a look again at our registrant class. This video assumes a couple of things that you have been following along with fundamentals demo series, and specifically have built up your registrant class that we started in earlier videos. You'll notice here that I have our registrant class up, and in this video, we're going to focus on our constructors for our registrant class. In the earlier videos, we've sort of just thrown our hands up in the air regarding error checking. If anything, we've put some comments in that indicated that we were supposed to do error checking, but we haven't touched it at all. And in this video, we're going to focus on a couple of different ways that we can make sure that we get a registrant object that is, in fact, valid. You'll notice here that I've already created our EE333.status enum. We did that in an earlier video, and we have a private field associated with that. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit about our two constructors. The first constructor accepts only a username and then simply blindly assigns that value to the local field variable. The second one accepts multiple input arguments and then again just simply assigns the value with no validation or no error checking. So first, why the two constructors? Or for that matter, if we decided to add another one, why would we? Well, the answer is partially convenience, but also how much information is actually required to create a instance of an object. And so, for instance, with this registrant class, you can assume that you are getting basic information about maybe the registrants for a conference or an event. And at the very least, you would like to have their username. As a matter of fact, if you did not have their username, you would argue that you don't even have a registrant to begin with. And then likewise, in the second constructor, you may have information like the username, first name, and last name all at once, and you can simply then create the registrant with that information. Either way, we would want to do some basic validation or error checking on the registrant when we call the constructor. Now, the thing or the difference between these two constructors and how we're going to handle the error checking or the results of the error checking will be slightly different. And if anything, I want you to see two different approaches to handling the constructor validation. And in the first one, we want to first agree that if we do not have a valid username, there is no point in creating the registrant object. In other words, we can sort of think of this as a fatal error that needs to be handled by the calling function. And so what we want to do is we want to check to see if we have a valid username. And if not, what we will find ourselves doing is throwing an exception. And we essentially want to consider this a fatal flaw, meaning that something drastic has happened. We do not want to create the registrant object. Instead, we want to kick that responsibility back to the calling function. And in the second constructor, we want to do the same. In other words, the username is vital, but the first name and last name, since they can be changed later, are important, but not fatal or not vital. And so as a result, how we handle the absence of enough information is going to be a little bit different in these two constructors. So let's start off first with our registrant. Rather, our registrant with a single input argument. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to set up an if statement that checks two things. We want to check to see if the username is null or the username dot length is equal to 0. Now, we need to do some more validation here, or some better validation. This is very basic. But fundamentally, if we are passed a null value or a zero-length string, not a valid username. And then under the else, we would simply continue on with our default processing of our default values, or rather initialize then the first name, last name, the active status, and the status. But under the true branch of this if statement, to demonstrate the fatal nature of this error, we would then want to throw a new exception. Now, we've got a couple of options here. We can start off with a generic exception, and we can simply put in then a message here: error failed to provide a valid username. And this is going to cause us a number of problems that we have to deal with. The first is going to be, you'll see this warning here that says an unreported exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. In other words, the constructor is throwing an exception that has to be handled somewhere else in the code. And it either needs to be handled inside of the registrant constructor, in which case we would put a try-catch block inside of the registrant constructor, or we simply delegate the handling of the exception to the calling function. And the way we do this is by adding a throws clause to our registrant constructor. Now, this is going to cause some more problems that we'll see in just a second, but the idea here is that we either handle the exception inside of the registrant constructor or pass it on to the calling function. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that we also have the ability to throw a different type of exception. We'll talk more about exceptions here, but one that you should consider here is going to be the illegal argument exception, and I'll provide a link to the Java documentation for it. Fundamentally, it just allows for you to have a more refined exception to be thrown to the calling function. For right now, we are just going to stick with our generic exception. Now, if we go ahead and build our project here, and then we come out to our fundamentals demo, you should now see another warning here that says an unreported exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. Again, we either had the opportunity to handle the exception inside of the constructor, or we simply pass that responsibility then to the calling function. In this case, it's our registered demo that now needs to handle the exception. And the way that you do this is you put a try-catch block in our registrant demo. And again, what we're going to do is we are going to capture the exception that would be thrown in the constructor. And much like in our earlier examples, we're just going to keep this simple, and we're going to have a system.out.println, and we're going to now print the results, or the toString rather, associated with that exception. Now, remember, in the constructor, we created a custom message that will be passed along in the exception. So hopefully what we'll see is that custom message that says that we failed to provide a username. And at this point, then what we want to do is we simply move then the entire sample here that we created in our earlier video. We simply move it inside of the try block. And so we're going to very carefully go ahead and cut or move and paste it inside of the try-catch block, and specifically in the try block. Now, you can play around with where you have your borders for your table, but fundamentally then what we want to do is we want to attempt to create a registrant using the G. Myers user ID. In this case, it should not throw an exception, but it's still necessary to have that try catch block. And then assuming then that it does not throw the exception, then we want to use the toString to see the default values. We'll use the set name, set first name, and set last name to set the other values. And again, we will simply print out the results of that operation. Now, what we want to do to demonstrate what's really going on here, though, is we're going to go ahead and create one more registrant. And we are going to call this one Registrant _03. We're going to leave our first one alone. We're not going to make any changes to it. We're going to leave our second one alone. But now what we're going to do is we're going to set up another try catch block. And we're going to demonstrate what happens when we do not provide a valid username. In other words, we're going to try to trigger this exception. And again, we're simply going to have a system.out.println, and we're going to call the toString method for the exception and hopefully get that custom message. And then now inside of our try block, again, I'm going to borrow some of the borders here just to make this look nice. We won't actually need all of the code we're about to write, and you'll see why in just a second. We're going to have our registrant _03 then is going to be equal to new EE333 registrant. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass an empty string. And at this point, then we can just mimic what we did with the first registrant. In other words, what we'll have here is a system.out.println for our registrant _03. And we're going to attempt to make a call then to our toString method. And then likewise, what we can do is we can follow up with the pattern that we've done earlier by simply just changing our registrant 01 to 03. And so a little bit of quick copying and pasting here will allow for us then to set our second example back up. And again, we're going to leave our registrant 02, which tests our other overloaded constructor. We're going to leave that one alone for now. We're just going to go ahead and build this. We're probably going to have one other warning that we have to fix. And if you'll go up to our earlier example of our array list with objects demo, because we were leveraging the constructor that used a single argument, it is also now going to be throwing an error. In this case, what we have to do is we need to simply wrap, again, this entire call to our constructor inside a try catch block. We're going to catch the exception. Again, we have a system.out.println. We print out the toString method. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're simply going to shift all of this and put this in our try portion of our try catch block. Now, again, I know this is a function that's outside of the original scope of this video. However, this demonstrates where a change in your registrant class can result in change that needs to be handled elsewhere in your code. And this is a perfect example of where we had to shift from a non-exception throwing constructor to an exception throwing constructor will cause then some changes elsewhere in your code. Now, at this point, we should be able to just go ahead and build this. We should now have a working demo again. And so the idea here is that we want to call our registrant demo. We do so by going out to our command window again and calling Java, then our EE333 fundamentals demo. we are going to use our registrant slash registrant slash demo switches. And you'll see a couple of things stay the same, particularly the ability to create our registrant using a single argument, that argument being the username, with the first name and last name having the default values. Its status is incomplete. But then we go back later and we update those fields and again display the object again. Notice that my status is still incomplete. We haven't talked about that yet. We will later on. But this second instance of the registrant, in other words, registrant underscore 02, nothing has changed there. But now notice here that we have nothing inside of our borders here. And as a matter of fact, we could probably take a second to change this up just so that it's a little clearer as to what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and move my border outside of the try catch block because technically we want that to print either way. And likewise in the second try catch block. And so what you can see now is actually going on is that inside that second attempt to construct the object, we are throwing a java.lang.exception. And specifically, it's telling us that we failed to provide a valid username. All right, so let's go back to our constructor, specifically our second constructor for just a second. And let's talk about how we would want to leverage this technique, not only throwing an exception, but also then leveraging the status. And specifically what we want to do is if all of the information is provided, we want to indicate that the status is complete. However, let's say that for some reason the correct or valid username was passed, but an invalid first name and last name was passed. The question is, do we want our constructor to throw an exception, or do we simply want to change the behavior so that the status is now incomplete or unknown? Again, what we will do is some error checking here. We're going to start off with an if statement that focuses on the username and checks to see if the username is null or the username dot length is equal to 0. And again, we are going to consider this a fatal error. So we're going to go ahead and throw the new exception. Again, we can consider throwing an illegal argument exception. And we'll have our error failed to provide a valid username. Now, again, we're going to get prompted here to add the throw clause to our constructor. As you can imagine, there is now a warning in our fundamentals demo that we're going to have to take care of. But what we want to do is we now want to look at what happens under the else branch. And so at this point, we will assume that our username is perhaps poorly validated, but validated nonetheless. And then what we can do is we can go through and we can check either all at once or individually whether the first name and last name fields were in fact valid. And so we can do this combination of ways. Probably the easiest to see to begin with is using a nested if statement. And so what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if our first name is equal to null or our first name dot length is equal to 0. And if that's the case, then what we want to do is we want to make sure that this dot status is going to be equal to EE333 dot status dot incomplete. And then under the else branch, we can simply assume then that we've done enough validation and that our first name is at least valid enough or passes our preliminary tests. And again, you would want to think about this, decide how much more in depth you want to go. In other words, can it have numeric values in it, etc. But we can repeat this pattern for our last name. And for that matter, we can repeat this pattern for any additional fields that we wish to pass to our constructor. Now, this constructor stays pretty simple here. It's just got 3 arguments that are being passed to it. But fundamentally here, the pattern is that if an individual field fails to pass validation, then what we want to do is we simply change the status to incomplete. And so at this point, then you can go ahead and get rid of some of this code here. And specifically what we want to do is we want to talk about what the default value for status should be. Well, what we can do is once we have set the username, we simply set the status to complete. And you can call this a little bit of naive optimism, meaning that we initially set it to complete, and then we look for reasons to mark it as incomplete. Again, none of the checks for first name and last name or any of the additional fields that we may choose to provide in the constructor would be fatal. And so the thing to note here is these are considered non-fatal flaws in our registrant. Put another way, we have to have a username, but maybe we don't have a first name and a last name. At this point, then, we can simply leave the default value for active alone, and we can choose whether we decide to put this inside of the else branch or outside. Doesn't really matter. But at this point, this constructor is fairly well validated. It's not perfect. Again, we could probably go back and do some additional checking on the last name, numbers, special characters, etc. But let's go ahead and build this one more time. Let's come back over to our fundamentals demo. And again, you'll see that it is complaining to us about needing a try-catch block. And you could also consider throwing this exception. If you throw the exception, then it would have to be handled in main, or the application is just simply going to crash. We are going to go ahead and surround this with a try-catch block. Again, it does a pretty good job of it, but we do need to move some code around. And specifically what we'll do is we'll move then our system.out.println, clean this up just a little bit. And you can see hopefully now where we have our 3 examples, in this case, all 3 of which using the try-catch block. Again, I'm going to build it one more time. We should have no more warnings. We should now be able to come out to the command line, run our registrant demo a couple of times. Here you'll notice that in the first example, we had an incomplete object. We will worry about validating that in just a second. I'll show you that in another video. But more importantly, our second one survives the construction. And then our last one, of course, does not. So hopefully this video is useful. You've seen now the benefits of throwing an exception in a constructor. The alternate, of course, would be that you simply leverage then the status. In other words, you simply control whether the object is considered complete or incomplete. So you basically have 2 alternatives here. You either handle it through some sort of flag or enum, or you simply throw an exception, or a combination of the 2. As always, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to email me.